Our next character is Mac, who um, whose opinion is stimulation and simulation. For this reason, what we're going to discuss revolves around simulated environments in physical reality. But it's not the same as what we've done previously with it, so I'll return in a second. Rather than repeating myself for him, he essentially thinks that different substances, such as this remote, have different behaviors and different features and properties, which behave unique to the object. And he studies these not to learn how they function, but to create his own sort of false sciences based around those objects. And for that reason, he doesn't create, he doesn't study science, he makes his own based off of artificial sciences, which he treats as different sorts of physical systems. And he'll use computers and various virtual things for when he can't replicate the process, or if he can't build something in the moment, he'll use a virtual program to do a similar utility. It's kind of complicated, and it's mostly metaphysics, but it's the manipulation of his metaphysics that allow him to discover different objects and different inventions within the properties that he's defined. And it works a lot like science, but it doesn't use the atom, it uses whatever he uses instead. And for that reason, it's kind of cool, because it's like science, but it's not the same. So it's like something other than an atom that would be in its place. And it isn't that it's real, it's that it's an artificial model that he created to simply look at the object as something else other than just what science says. So we'll get a piece of paper, and I'll show you how that works. First thing you do is find an object of study. We're going to use green cotton fluff stuff. Then all you do is describe it. So you would say it's green, fluffy, fibrous. There are many ways to do this. It's not the only way. You basically try your best to create your own science. It works only because you obey what the rules of the object say, and you don't test it to see if how accurate the assumptions are, and you use just the appearance of the object, not like the actual makeup inside of it, to create that thing. So it's a little bit different from science in that you can't do it the same way, but you can do some very similar stuff with it. And I'll get into that in a second. I don't know, is there another property of this? No, we'll go with 3. Once you've written down your properties, you explain how, through something like a metaphysics or a physics system, how they function. So, and you try to make them more universal, which means that if everything is fluffy and fibrous, then you would look at it that way. But we're going to go with, this is one element, and we're only going to do one because they can take a little bit of time. But we'll say that this is based off of its color property, which in turn is created by a variety of shapes, like triangles, squares, and circles. And each triangle, square, and circle represents a different color. The fluff is by a smoke inside the substance, and the fibrous form is due to a sort of static connection between that smoke. So our atom would look something like smoke connected at various points in a more fibrous manner, so like that, and it would contain small triangle particles which reflect the color. And this functions up until you test it and realize that that's not what it looks like. But because you can't actually see the particle that I've described, you can basically imagine it, and you can use it. For example, to change the color, you would simply swap the color particle. To do that would require simply coloring the particle, or coloring the particles, and you can go into detail on how changing the color works. So you could say that when you apply a new color to the green, the triangle gains more sides, and as you increase the color, they gain even more sides. You can go deeper into this and say that those shapes are made out of two different properties called point and line, and maybe even a sort of film portion that actually defines the color. You can say that the static is a sort of tube that contains special particles which transfer between them, and you can say that the smoke itself has no particle and simply exists, and that these particles permit something to do with the fibrous nature. So these particles permit entanglement and through the rearrangement and reconnection at different points. And that would mean that, like, they sort of connect like this and like this, or like this at different points, and that's how something gets tangled, like this. It also sticks to my hand sometimes. If you can see, yeah, there we go. And I could say that this is because of that entanglement with my finger. You could then try to find a way to explain how the entanglement then, or how you could transmute this into a more solid form through wax, or by adding wax to it. So you could argue that the entanglement increases while its fluffiness decreases. And this permits a simulated physics system which doesn't obey the same rules as the atom, but still essentially fits with the object in question. And the more you complexify the system, the more complex it becomes. But say I wanted to manipulate these things in some way, I would simply, I would say if I want to make this, or I've given a couple examples of that already, but say I want to remove the fluffy nature, I would know that I would simply have to decrease how fluffy it is. And to do that, I would simply have to do something to this to make it less fluffy. And that would be how. And then I could explain how the wax, as an example, is a different substance entirely, which decreases fluffiness. And explain that through, like, fluffiness absorbers inside the wax, which eat and sort of pull in the clouds at a varying degree and causes them to become more solid. And like, it makes sense, it's just not the actual science of it, but it allows for a lot more creative expression, especially when you're making a world. But there are other ways to do this. For example, say you wanted to then detect or like measure or like gain access to some information that you can't perceive and you can't test it. You can always use a computer to create a sort of artificial like measuring tool that doesn't actually connect to anything, but still detects the information required. And you can base that either off random or things you code into it yourself. You can also see how your described behaviors can interact with other things that you've invented and find different things you could do with that, much like we know that the ball of wax and fluff is a light but relatively stable ball which can be thrown and is lighter than clay or polymer clay. That's a very simple example, but you could argue that has to do with the fluff absorbers, which increase the weight of the fluff or the smoke, but permit less fluff to it and less more of that. It's not as simple as our original physics system, which only comprised 4 elements and was mostly just a visual thing. This permits like all kinds of manipulation and like creative uh, creative universes, and there are lots of ways you can mess with the artificial nature of it to make it do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do with science, simply because it doesn't provide near as much creativity as an artificial particle or absentine particle. And you might even discover something new about the properties of an object while doing this. You won't be able to explain it the same way a scientist could, but you will be able to use it in some manner. Overall, it's rather interesting, and there is more information and another example of this with a bit more detail. It uses a different version, but there's more of it on the blog portion of this character. And this is just the metaphysics part. I'm gonna come back with the one from the blog, and I'm going to manipulate the different physics to create a object of some kind. I can't go into that one because it's a bit more detailed, but this example shows how it works. So I'll be back. Okay, so this is our basic physics. It works with words, so it has 5 layers of complexity. There's more information on what this stuff means on the blog portion, but what you need to know is that in the system, substances do not bond and they do not change state. Rather, they coincidentally cause other things to occur. For example, the cloud substance, which is an air substance called cloud, and water are not the same element. Instead, water is created through coincidental appearances of it in the clouds, and clouds appear through coincidental appearances near water. So, they don't work the same way, and to use them requires knowing their properties, which are based off of color, but that's why this is blue and this is white, because those are their colors, which are not the same as their colors in observable reality, but it's complicated. What we're doing is we're going to try to create a substance that is both of them, which would be in this case, something like an air and like a glass. So a reflective glass, or a particulate reflective air glass. I don't know how you do that. I imagine it would probably be snow. But we're gonna try to build one. Yeah, I kind of ruined it by saying it's snow. Depending on how you approach the substance, it would probably be snow. Because snow is somewhat reflective, somewhat particulate, and somewhat, that matches the requirement. It doesn't look the same, and it would be an entirely different substance, but The manipulation of the different variables at different layers creates new substances which you can discover. So like swapping the blue here, putting it here would create a wet gas, so that's more like steam, rather than clouds, which aren't overly wet. They're more cloudy, I guess, because they exist in the sky and you can't touch them, so they are not wet. A floating water would be probably, see that one would probably be the atmosphere, because it's blue and looks like water. And you can see how these things change the way you look at objects in the environment, because now the sky is full of water during the day. You can make like physics with that. The problem is that these substances are actually not the most useful. And I'm looking for some manner of manipulation, so I'll be back. I'd always create a smaller version of the sky water, cloud, rain, water, steam, and snow cycle, through using similar objects with similar properties. So I imagine the sky would be something like blue paint. This would be fluff, which is soaked or frozen, and I guess you pass it through, or I don't know how you get the ice out. I guess you shake it, but you can recreate the substance through these, and that would actually work with this, because fluff is considered an air substance. It's kind of interesting. Like, I don't know what you'd use that for, but you could do that. It's all about how you manipulate the substances to create the physical systems described. It's certainly interesting. It adds detail. I'm not going to spend all day trying to find something to do with it by studying various properties and messing with it, but it's mostly the same as just inventing an object. As per usual, you would ascribe meaning and some sort of interaction between the substances that you make, and you would do very similar to the week I did, where you would spend the time to create various things to do with the substance. But the difference is that you're constraining yourself to special physics that you created, and that almost makes the realism far more realistic than just basing yourself off of basic phases, because you've got an entire physics system that goes along with it. So it makes for a more immersive creation, and that is what stimulation is about, is the immersion. So that's what he has to teach. Symbols for the picture. The water represents the actual substance and the rules that it behaves by. The television represents the artificiality of the of what you create. The controller represents the ability to manipulate that substance that you create. The building represents the things you can build with it, And the sun represents your ability to control what you create. His cuts represent stimulation, because it's the most stimulated part of the body is pain, but it's a different story entirely. But that's why